I'm not presenting you with a rehash of other people's experience. This has certain value, but it also means that I have a special point of view, which is my own. I deliberately don't read up other people's experiences in this field because I don't want to be biased or moved out of the direction in which I find I'm going. I know that the work I do has been guided. I never sought to do this work in the first place. It came to me. For that reason, I want to stay as unsullied by other people's experience as I can. I first got interested in the paranormal, as we call it these days, when I was about 13 years of age. Having been put in that direction, I think, by a near-death experience at the age of 5 or 6. I had an operation at that age, a tonsillectomy, which was something that people had on the very least excuse in those days. And coming out of the anaesthetic, I found myself hurtling along a tunnel at great speed. Those of you who know the near-death experience accounts will recognise that. And I was very upset indeed. I couldn't remember where I'd been, but I certainly didn't want to leave it. I arrived in consciousness in the side ward of the hospital, very, very upset indeed at having been torn away from somewhere that seemed, I can only describe it as a place of great felicity. And I carried this with me, and I was attending Sunday school in those days as a little boy and saying to myself, they're not telling us the truth. They're not telling us the truth. So I started to look for the truth. And at the age of 13, I was reading Encyclopedia of Psychic Science. It was introduced by Sir Oliver Lodge, an eminent physicist of those days. Some of you may have heard of him. Once I'd started to read that book, I realized intuitively that this was the goal I'd been seeking. And from that point on, I never stopped searching. But no personal experience occurred with me until I was about 53 or 4. That's a long time to have to wait. And I started doing healing, and from healing I moved on to what I call clairsentience, which at times turns into some form of clairvoyance. Do always make sure that you have control, that you can say enough. You can opt out at any point, so that if an experience worries you, push it away. That is very important. Never give up your integrity to anyone else or anything else. There's no need to. I work in that way. I always know what's going on. At the same time, my consciousness moves to another level when I have the experiences I shall describe. Sometimes I do this voluntarily. Well, in a sense, it's always voluntary because I could stop it if it weren't. But in other times, it's almost as though I'm nudged by something, as again you'll see. Well, let's go back to one of the earliest experiences I had. I was sitting with the president of the College of Psychic Studies in her office, having only met her once or twice before, and suddenly I had a feeling of distress. I knew somebody, somewhere was very upset. So I allowed my consciousness to move into a response mode, if you like. First thing I got was London always was a noisy place. Outside at that moment, the pneumatic drills were going in a building next door, and this was picked up. It was a man that was with me, and it unfolded that this man had lived in the latter half of the Victorian era. He'd worked for a very cruel master. He himself was badly deformed. He was what we these days would call spastic. His master regarded him as subhuman, and this man said to me, I had a terrible life with him. The only relief I got was when he beat me, and that tells you something. And he was stuck at the earth level. And the reason he was stuck, as he said, was, I don't want to go where he is. I don't want to go where he is. And this fear that he would meet up again with a cruel master was what held him back. Well, after a little while, we managed to get him to understand that there was no chance of that whatever. He accepted that, and it opened his mind, And at that point, he was led away into the light. Now, this is a characteristic of many of these releases. I call them releases rather than rescues. They are earthbound for one of a great variety of reasons. And in that state, they are not fully conscious of the passage of time. Some have been trapped for centuries. Some have been trapped for a very short time. One who was trapped for many centuries said to me at a later time, I suppose about 2 years after he was released from that condition, he said, "The time since you helped me to escape from that state seems to me longer than all the time that went before." So that's a merciful thing, because were it otherwise, these people would suffer a great deal more than they actually do. So let's go on to another case, an interesting one. I was called into a house where a young lady, she was a single mother, had been worried by a presence in the house. She was psychic herself. She'd seen a very tall man, and at one stage it seemed to her he tried to push one of her children down the stairs. So she got very alarmed at this and asked me if I would go along. So I went along with a colleague. I'd only just sat down in the living room. Within a few moments I tuned into this man. Turned out that he had suffered a very painful life in about the 13th century. He'd lived either on the site of this new house, as it was, or somewhere near it, in a village outside Nottingham. He was very tall, as tall went in those days, rather ungainly. He was laughed at and derided by the other children as he grew up. And of course they were, in those days, particularly cruel to anyone that was a little bit different. People still are sometimes, but I think it was even worse then. And they regarded him with a mixture of derision and suspicion. He discovered this suspicion, this other worry they had, and played on it after a time. And if they bothered him too much, he would act as though he was going to put a curse on them. It was enough to keep them at bay. But as he grew up, things didn't get any better. He lived on the outskirts of the village with his mother. When his mother died, they seized him at a later point, and they tied him to I would say a pole or the thin trunk of a tree, and put him through the ordeal that sometimes they put people through by submersing him in water tied to this long pole. He drowned. He was stuck due to the horror of his death and the fears that went with it. Fear is often a major factor in trapping people, and he'd been in that state ever since. I went through his death experience with him, and this isn't often necessary because it's like the psychiatrist taking someone through a catharsis in the process of psychiatry, and it releases them from the emotional bondage that whatever event is involved is exercising. And once I got him through that, then he was obviously much relieved, and I was waiting for the next stage to occur. And I ought to explain that I don't do this work on my own, because there is an invisible team on the other side, invisible to me that is, who sometimes seem to set these things up and nearly always arrange some sort of finality to whatever takes place. And it's always very, very appropriate. So I could see then, by this time, I could see this man, I could see the background of that hut where he lived, the trees surrounding the clearing. I was wondering what would happen, and a voice called from the woods to him, and it was his mother's voice. The importance of this was it opened up a channel of love, a response. He loved his mother. There weren't many other people. In fact, there was no one else he loved, but his mother he loved. So his mother called to him, and I thought at first his mother was going to come to him. But a man appeared from the woods, dressed as a friar, and he walked across to our friend and said, "Do you remember me?" And he didn't at first, but the man reminded him of the circumstances, that when he was a boy, this friar was passing, and his mother made the man welcome. She gave him food and drink, and he talked to the boy, and the boy had never met anyone like this before, and he was very impressed, and he thought for a